So, about 7 years ago, I fell in love with a blonde who liked to laugh. She's actually sitting in the front row right now, but I can't actually see her, which is probably a good thing because she's probably giving me the iciest stare in the world because I'm about to embarrass her in front of the entire audience. But I'll deal with that later. Now, this is a woman, ladies and gents, who, every day that I have known her, disagrees with nearly everything I seem to have an opinion on. It could be little things like what to have for dinner that night, what to go watch at the movies that evening. That's usually a big one. But I don't mind telling you folks, it gets pretty heated at our dinner table, especially when we're talking about the more contentious issues of the day. And we do this, we're one of those couples. We talk about the big debates of the day, like religion and politics and truth. It's endless, endless. But wonderful, truly. And some of you in the audience might know what I'm talking about here. It's having someone there with you that challenges you and forces you to challenge yourself. I think it makes me a better man. Now, Heidi and I, about 2 years ago, we founded a documentary company called CODOC. And what we try to do with CODOC is we try to do just that. We try to challenge and provoke and change using our stories. But there are times, folks, that some stories end up changing the storytellers themselves. And this is one such story. About 2 years ago, we were in northern Uganda for one of our first films. The subject of the film was about child soldiers and the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. Now, some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some aspects of this story. The familiar narrative involves this man, Joseph Kony, and his militia group, the LRA rebels. The LRA have routinely abducted young children, young boys and girls, as part of the militia, but also as sex slaves and mules forced to carry heavy loads through filthy jungles. But I've got a question for you. Which of these young boys is the victim of this war, and which is the perpetrator? This was a story that faced myself and Heidi when we were there 2 years ago. Because remember, most of these children were forcibly abducted into the LRA, but they were also forced to commit unspeakable crimes to members of some of their own communities, as vulnerable as they were. And what we learned by trying to tell this story was that answers to questions like that cannot be examined through traditional narratives. And we learned that through some of the stories we heard on the ground. Now, this is George Odong. He's a straight-talking giant of a man. And he was part of a delegation that met with Kony during some failed peace negotiations in 2006. Now, we posed that question to him. How does accountability work in a place like northern Uganda, given the difficulties in prescribing and attributing guilt for crimes? Who goes to jail in northern Uganda? Who is held accountable? And when we asked that question to George, his response was simple. Well, ideally, he said, no one. You see, George consulted with many communities in northern Uganda, families and communities whose lives were ruined by the LRA and Kony. And when he posed that question to him, what would they do? How would they feel if those that had done them wrong so gravely were captured and brought home? How would they feel? What would they want to do? Their response was as simple: forgiveness. Now, I don't know about you, but my first initial response to that was, how does that work exactly? How could it be feasible that former war criminals would be allowed back to a country, given a lawful amnesty, and live side by side with the very communities that they had terrorized for the last 2 decades? I don't know if I could do that. That's a question I'd want you to think about. Would you be able to forgive for that? Now, George's response to this, when I told him my initial response, he told us the responses the communities gave him when he posed that concern. He said to us, he looked at us straight in the eye, I remember this, he said, You are not the victim here. Your children were never taken away. You might find this idea of forgiveness vague and conflicting and naive and illogical and unfeasible. But we choose forgiveness. We choose to tell our own story. We have heard different. We choose, not you. Smack. That's how it felt to us. And I can't tell you how much that spun out myself and Heidi, because we thought we were there to tell a story about accountability and justice and truth. We thought we knew the story before we even landed in northern Uganda. And yeah, it might sound naive and illogical, but indeed, there are former war criminals and people who have committed unspeakable crimes living side by side with communities that fear them. Now, it's not perfect, of course it's not. And there is deep resentment simmering amongst many returnees. But the challenging thing for myself and Heidi was that their idea of the court system of justice, in what they deemed our system, to them seemed just as naive. How does that help, they would say? How did lawyers help you heal? How do your communities learn to move on? How does that help you to heal? Now, I thought I would never find a counter-argument to court justice, but there it was, at least in this context. There are times when a deep dose of humility helps us understand this world, and it's something that we're not used to when we watch our television screens. But the question is, why is that? Why don't we think about forgiveness as a viable option for rehabilitation and reconciliation, especially when it's the very victims who are putting across that idea? Why is it when I look out my window and I see a world that's full of contradictions and questions and really weird ideas, that I don't see that when we tell stories to ourselves about our world that we live in? Why is it when I go to Uganda and I see something that's incredibly complex, but when I see a video or a YouTube story about that issue, it's always a black and white thing. It's always a black and white story. It's good guys, bad guys, victim, perpetrator. Why is that? Well, when I pose that question to most storytellers in the room, I get this answer. You've got to dumb it down, guy. Heidi, you need to dumb it down. Now, TEDsters, here's an idea for you. How about we ban phrases like that? Who's with me with that one? Yeah, I thought you might. Heidi and I wanted to fire people up. We wanted to get them to give a damn about human rights stories, to get them to care, get them to draw a line in the sand and stand for something. But maybe the best way to do that is to approach stories like this, like international justice, through multiple narratives, myriad of voices, not just one or two. Because there are stories out there that help inspire change, but there are also stories that trap you in an echo chamber, especially if it's one story we keep hearing. I came back from northern Uganda determined to tell stories that challenged my own perspectives as much as it did my audience's. Now, there's a tendency out there, especially within the documentary world, where we have campaigns follow stories. Now, I'm not convinced that that's the best way we encourage action, because before action, I believe that we need to encourage critical thinking. It's the responsibility that comes with owning an opinion and acting on that opinion. Now, where are we without those provocations of doubt? Even if it means pushing ourselves into uncomfortable areas. Where are we if we don't let ourselves go there? Those are the stories I'd like to tell. Meaningful stories. Not vehicles to push an agenda, but stories that make you either reaffirm or change outright how you feel about things. Because here's the thing. It's going to get harder. The world's gotten smaller while the audiences has gotten way, way bigger. And more we're going to find ourselves telling stories to people who have heard different. And our job as storytellers, I believe, is not to tell people what to think. It's too easy. It's too easy on them. Our job, I believe, is to get them to think in the first place. If we're going to own our stories and if we're going to advocate for them, let's struggle with them. I believe it'll make us better storytellers. I believe it'll make us better advocates for change. Because in a world where the borders between our stories, where the narratives of our world begin clashing with other interpretations of it, if we're going to stand for something, if we're going to stand for anything, let's try harder. So to you all, storytellers, and I'm sure everyone in this room is a storyteller in some capacity, let's not start out by knowing it all. Let's raise the bar for our audiences by raising the bar for ourselves. Let us rigorously challenge our own stories so that we may earn the right to challenge others. Thank you.